She placed the plate down with the same careful motion she had used all evening, fingers steady, despite the soreness that lived in her shoulders. Crystal chandeliers cast pale gold over linen napkins and polished silver, conversations braided with the gentle hiss from the kitchen. A waiter balanced a tray like a practiced tightrope walker. The room smelled of charred rosemary and citrus butter. On a corner table, a woman with a necklace that caught the light like a private sun watched Emily approach with a small, impatient smile. Evelyn Monroe wore Entitlement the way others wore perfume, an accent, a signature. Her friends clustered close, laughter prearranged between them, their opinions ready to drop like stones. Emily, 21, black, uniform starched, a name tag that read Emily in neat block letters, had worked a double shift earlier that week. She'd been saving for tuition, for a small dorm room, for a future where she didn't have to guess whether rent and textbooks would fit into the same paycheck. Tonight she moved through the room as if part of the furniture. Quick, efficient, practiced kindness folded into every gesture. Emily set the plate in front of Evelyn and offered, "How is everything?" Evelyn lifted a fork and examined a strip of steak as if it were evidence. "It's undercooked," she said. Her tone had the casual cruelty of someone who mistook other people's labor for a performance meant to reflect upon her. "And the seasoning. Do you even have a chef? Or is this what passes for honest cooking in places like this?" A hush narrowed across the table nearest them. The clink of glassware continued elsewhere, but at that table the rhythm slowed. Two of Evelyn's friends exchanged a look that was equal parts curious and amused. A few nearby diners shifted, uncomfortable beneath the comment that had the thinnest edge of contempt. Emily's smile did not falter. It couldn't. "I'm sorry about that," she said, voice even. "If you would like, I can have the kitchen prepare another, exactly how you prefer." Evelyn's eyes flicked to Emily's hands. "Do you mind explaining why you are addressing me like I'm in charge of the kitchen? I've eaten at better places. I don't want to have to come back here and—" She paused, as if deciding whether to be charming or cutting, and landed on cutting, "waste my evening, my—" There was a small sound from someone at a neighboring table, a chair scooting back, an awkward intake of breath. The manager, a lean woman with a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes tonight, glanced up from a clipboard. She had heard the edge. She began to move. Emily's jaw tightened. For a moment she considered the things she'd been taught: patience, professionalism, the long list of customer service rules that had been recited to her during training like a litany. But there was something in Evelyn's voice that made other words rise, words that were not polite or prescribed but human and sharp in their need to be heard. Evelyn pushed a scattered napkin away with a manicured hand and laughed lightly, as if to dismiss any offense she might have caused. "Don't be delicate," she said aloud, and the laugh cut like a thin blade. "Really, this isn't the kind of place you should be working if you have big dreams. It's small time." One of the friends reached toward Evelyn's sleeve as if to check the social temperature. The other simply smiled, the kind of smile that comfortably rides on another's power. The table's laughter resumed, a private comedy. A few conversations near the back fell silent. Emily felt surrounded not by people but by an atmosphere, the concentrated humidity that happens when embarrassment is served in public. Her hands, steady before, betrayed a small tremor as she picked up the check. She pretended it was nothing. She told herself she could keep going, that the kitchen counted on her, that she would get to school if she kept doing the work. "Excuse me," Evelyn said louder now, reaching for a damning finality. "Do you even know how to take an order properly? Honestly, it's like dealing with someone who hasn't been taught basic manners." The room tightened. Conversations paused, the music in the background dimmed by degrees in people's attention. A few phones found pockets, not to film yet, but to steady hands. Emily's manager crossed the room, a tight professional smile forced into place. She bent slightly as she spoke to Emily, concern in the wordless slope of the movement. "I'll take care of that," she mouthed, as if to say she saw everything and would act in whatever way the business required. Across the restaurant, by a small bar, a man in a gray suit sat as an island of stillness. He watched without the theatricality of glares or the posture of accusation. His eyes were quiet. His attention was the kind that notices small things, like the way someone steadies a plate or how a napkin hangs. He didn't look like a tourist. He looked like someone who belonged to the building, to the decision-making, to the ownership of the room. He was eating slowly, savoring each bite like someone who had the luxury of tasting time. There is a pressure that comes when dignity is threatened in public. It shifts the room sideways. Patrons consider leaving or intervening, or laughing to hide the unease. No one did any of those things. Instead, the discomfort created a lens. Eyes narrowed slightly, mouths drew thin, hands stilled. People watched Emily more closely, and in watching, recognized a person with a life beyond the uniform. That recognition is the first grain of change in any small, crowded theater of cruelty. Emily set the check on the table with measured care and said, "I'll bring the next one right away, miss, if you'd still like it." Evelyn rolled her eyes and tapped her finger against the glass like it was a metronome counting Emily's patience. "No, that won't be necessary," she said. "Just make sure that they know what real service looks like. Do you understand?" The manager nodded and asked Evelyn if she would like anything else while the kitchen prepared the replacement. As they spoke, the man in the gray suit rose, walked to the manager briefly, lowered his voice into something private. He pointed subtly toward Evelyn's table, then at Emily once more. A small conversation happened then, so quiet it could have been about the weather. The manager approached the hostess stand, hands a little slower, and spoke into her ear. There was a brief exchange with the chef. A bottle of champagne that had been resting on ice behind the bar began to move toward the pass, carefully routed through the corridor that led to the dining room. Emily wiped another table with a practiced arc, focusing on the repetition to keep from thinking of how tight everything inside her chest felt. She felt watched, an exposure that unmoored the place between professional armor and personal wound. She breathed through the work, each movement a small, quiet proof of endurance. At Evelyn's table, a friend leaned in and said, "Don't be so sensitive," as if sensitivity were a moral failing and cruelty a neutral act. "Some people," the friend went on, "just don't know any better." The phrase landed awkwardly, because there was no ignorance in how Evelyn spoke. There was intention. But it also showed how private clusters of power clothed themselves in sympathy for the aggressor. They argue that the world is cumbersome for everyone. They claim inconvenience, and they do not see how small slights map onto bigger patterns. The manager returned carrying a silver tray. On it sat a flute of champagne whose bubbles rose like tiny clarions. Beside it lay an envelope, cream, and unmarked. A murmur ran under the porcelain. People listen when a staff member moves with something glossy and official. "I'm sorry for how things went," the manager said, speaking both to the table and into the room in a low, professional voice. "The owner asked that this be brought over for you, as a gesture on the house." Evelyn's smile tightened into something poised. "That's unnecessary," she said, flagging a dismissal that was half pride, half script. The tray set down. The waiter announced neutrally, "From the house," and people nearby turned their heads, curiosity sharpening. The man in the gray suit rose from his seat at the bar. He walked across the room with the deliberateness of someone who did not need to make a show of moving. He stopped a respectful distance from Evelyn's table and folded his hands in front of him. "My name is Charles Donovan," he said, voice even and smooth. He was neither loud nor performative. He had the authority of someone accustomed to being heard without having to demand it. "I own this restaurant." For a heartbeat, Evelyn's expression flickered. Surprise, then the rapid calculation of how to claim her standing in the new equation. She smiled, a glossy smile. "Oh? Well, Mr. Donovan, I never—" Charles did not let her finish. He looked at Emily, and then back at Evelyn, and the room held its breath. Not because he raised his voice, but because the quiet of his presence had the authority of a bell not yet struck. "This is Emily," Charles said simply. "She's been working here for a long time. She's in school. She's saving for college." There was a visible intake of breath from the table. The little constellation of privilege at the corner shifted, as if their orbit had been nudged. Evelyn's friends went still. The room, which had been lukewarm in its indignation, warmed to a different temperature. Recognition. Evelyn's lip curled the smallest fraction. I didn't realize. This isn't about your bill or about being a valued guest, Charles interrupted, but not unkindly. It's about decency. Money does not give anyone the right to diminish another person's humanity, not in my house, and not anywhere I happen to be. He folded the unmarked envelope toward Evelyn and set the champagne gently near Emily's side of the table. We'll cover this evening's meal, he said, and we'll be donating the value of her tab tonight to a local organization that supports young women pursuing education and work opportunities. A faint ripple of surprise moved through the room, then a soft applause, the kind that begins at the edges and moves inward. It was not a triumphal cheer. It was an acknowledgement like a small bell. This is how things should sometimes be remade. Evelyn's cheeks had color in them now, a mix of ember and private heat. She had the sudden awareness of being observed not for something fashionable or successful, but for having behaved in a way that required correction. Her friend's laughter dried up. The silence that took its place had a weight to it heavy enough to make a person shift. I don't want a scene, Evelyn managed. Her voice was thinner. It's not a scene, Charles said. It's a reminder. Respect costs nothing. It's a standard I expect in the places I'm responsible for. If you have a concern with our food, we'll address it. If your complaint ends in demeaning the people who make that meal possible, we'll make it right where we can and learn a different posture. Emily couldn't think at first. The muscles that had been tight around her throat unclenched in a small, private relief. Tears hovered too close to the surface, ridiculous doorkeepers to a stage she hadn't meant to perform upon. She kept them back. She nodded, because nodding is an honest thing that says thank you without promising other people will behave better tomorrow. Someone at a neighboring table stood and said softly, "That's the right way to handle it." And others murmured their agreement. Charles turned to Evelyn for a moment, his tone measured, not accusing in a way that would punish, but instructive in a way that corrected. There are ways to ask for what you want, he said. There are also ways to model how you expect the world to respond to you. If you want excellence, you can ask for it without tearing someone down. Consider this a chance to learn. Evelyn's hand, which had nervous energy in it a moment before, tightened around her napkin. She looked smaller, not because money had been taken from her, but because attention had been redirected toward the dignity she had overlooked. She did not argue. She did not retort. She gathered her companions and left with the kind of hurried, embarrassed stride that reveals how self-possession can dissolve quickly when it is not rooted in compassion. Emily exhaled in a way she hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Her manager came over and put a hand to her shoulder, which was brief and professional, and in that hand, there was gratitude. A colleague at the pass shouted up, "Nice work tonight, Em," and a few kitchen doors opened as if to spill supportive light. Around the room, people tipped more generously than expected. A diner who had watched the exchange left a card with a note. "For your tuition, keep going." A young couple said to her as they left, "You handled that with grace." Grace was a word she didn't always feel she had the right to possess. Tonight someone else assigned it to her, and it fit awkwardly but true. Charles watched the room then, the way a gardener looks over a newly planted bed. He did not gloat. He did not draw a bead of spectacle. He simply moved back to his seat, the ripple of the restaurant settling into its rhythms again. A few moments later, he caught Emily's eye. "On your break. Come see me," he said quietly. "My treat. And we'll talk about scholarships and schedules. We want you here, and we want to help." In the kitchen, someone exclaimed under their breath, "Did you hear that?" And the sound felt less like gossip and more like relief. Evelyn left in silence. There was no dramatic exit, no final sharp barb. Her friends fanned her out of the door, as if rescuing her from the electric blemish of being corrected in public. The doorway shut behind them, and the restaurant breathed again. Later, when the rush faded and the staff swapped out aprons and the kitchen lights mellowed into after-hours amber, Emily sat in the small employee room, with a paper cup of tea in her hands. Her break was a place where exhaustion and tiny triumphs could live together. She thought of the envelope that had been set near her table. Not opened, not taken. A symbolic chalk mark across a ledger that said some accounts could be set as right. She thought of Charles's measured voice and of patrons who had shifted their behavior because someone in charge had demonstrated how to hold people accountable with dignity. Kindness, she reflected, was often a quiet currency. It didn't announce itself with banners. It arrived in small acts: a raised hand from a manager, a covered bill turned to charity, a whispered, "You did good," from a coworker wiping down a counter. Those small things accumulated like coins. They did not make the past disappear. They did not guarantee Evelyn ever learned a hard lesson. But they did make the room safer, if only for a while. Outside, under the soft halo of the streetlights, Evelyn's car pulled away. No one followed her. The man in the gray suit, whose name she had learned was Charles Donovan, paid his bill and left a modest note for the staff on his way out. Continue to be the kind of place that looks after its people. The note was the kind of sentence that translated into practices: better training, small scholarships, perhaps a more visible pledge that employees' dignity would not be negotiable. In the weeks after, regulars noticed a difference. Conversations at the bar had a gentler edge. Servers exchanged fewer guarded glances and more quiet check-ins. The local organization that received the donation put out a short message of thanks without naming names, and the staff knew a small piece of a fund existed to help young women like Emily with tuition or emergency needs. What mattered most was not the public correction. It was the way a leader in an ordinary place chose a response that affirmed dignity over display. It was the way patrons who had been bystanders realized there was a different way to be present. Not to pretend nothing happened, not to remain neutral when unkindness pressed on someone else's face, but to offer small, practical supports. A compliment, a larger tip, a hand offered with a truthful word. Emily finished her shift and walked into the San Diego night carrying both the tiredness of labor and the clearer pulse of hope. She had served people who would never know her full story and had been belittled by someone who assumed power could shape reality. She had also been seen by someone who decided to act in a manner consistent with the values he ran his restaurant by. The balance did not erase the sting, but it shifted the ledger. When the story settled into the small language of the community, people scripted their own version of the lesson. That money does not buy immunity from kindness. That power, when exercised with humanity, can correct rather than crush. That a single calm voice in a room can redirect the tone of an entire evening. It was not a moral given that all would be resolved perfectly. It was simply a moment where accountability arrived without humiliation and support arrived without spectacle. If you felt this scene land with you, if it reminded you that respect is not a favor but a baseline, share it and subscribe for more stories that hold dignity at their center.